Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is a joint production from Componize and Data Conversion Laboratory, or DCL as we are also known. My name is Marianne Kalahana. I'm the VP of Marketing at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'm here to welcome everyone today and introduce From Unstructured to Structured Content, Transforming Legacy Aircraft Documentation from PDFs to DITA XML. Today's webinar is being recorded and it will be available on both the Componize website at componize.com as well as the DCL website at dataconversionlaboratory.com. You will receive an email with links to both the websites, and I am so happy to introduce today's speakers. We have our partner at Componize, Dipo Ajose-Coker. He is the product ambassador at Componize. And my colleague, David Turner. David is our digital transformation consultant at Data Conversion Laboratory. Welcome, gentlemen.
I think that my screen sharing went off actually here, so
it looks like this. Yeah,
so
we're gonna pull those.
Let's try
back.
Just join and get those slides back up, and we'll get rolling there.
During today's conversation and presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them via the chat dialog box here in the Demio platform. We have saved time at the end of this presentation to answer anything you'd like to ask our two content structure experts. All right, gentlemen, turning it over to you.
Thanks so much. All right, Dipo, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll get rolling.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah, Dipo Ajose-Coker. I work with Componize as a product ambassador. I'm an ex-English teacher from the UK. And in 2005, moved to France and took an MA in technical writing. And I've been working as a technical writer ever since until, well, a couple of years ago when I joined Componize as product ambassador creating content. I've got 16 years writing documentation, and like 14 of those have been spent in medtech or fintech, i.e. regulated environments. Got experience in authoring structured and unstructured content and migrating technical documents into DITA, and a bit of content strategy as well. Learn from all of that. Componize, let me just introduce you to Componize. Who are we and what do we do? Well, we're built on an Alfresco platform, and Alfresco is an open source CMS. So you get all the features from Alfresco, including user management, permissions, customizable workflows. And as Componize sits on top of Alfresco, you get all the benefits of that platform, including like security, cost efficiencies, sustainability, and so much more that you get from an open source based platform. Componize is also based on open standards and open APIs. Open standards mean like we're able to accept pretty much any XML document type. We don't change your source code. Your XML remains pure DITA, for example, so as not to lock you into our solution. We're not about that. We're about helping our customers. And with open APIs, you can pretty much plug in anything you want into Componize. Next one. So, well, with Componize, you can manage your legacy content, including non-XML documents. So things like Word files, InDesign, PDF, digital assets, CAD files, and all of that can also be version controlled. You can have previews of this. You can have access management. So you make sure that certain people cannot touch certain types of files. So for example, engineering can manage all their CAD files in Componize, and users can see previews. Writers can then make cross-references to the version that they want. Marketing can store data sheets and other content in Componize, making it easy to collaborate and reference that kind of information. The advanced search capabilities of Componize also takes advantage of the metadata stored within the files as well as applied to files. And so you search within Componize, you're able to find pretty much anything you want. You got fine-tuned permissions and access controls with the metadata management. I just mentioned that for a second. And it's basically you're able to extract all your metadata, work on it in your taxonomy tool, and then inject those back at the right level to the right files. So if your taxonomy is changed, you don't need to worry about like having to apply it one by one to individual files. Or Componize can handle that for you. As I mentioned before, so it's pure XML. Now we can handle S1000D, DocBook, Markdown, all of that sort of XML. If you use your content across many different platforms, it's an ideal solution because you can, like, for example, plug in your chatbot to the segments of information and have that interact with the chatbot and your end user. So if you want to keep the flexibility and cross-platform ability of your DITA XML, well, Componize is one of your best solutions without having to write special rules just to control that.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Well, quickly about me, if I sound funny, it's because I'm from Texas. I live in the Dallas area in a suburb called Saxe. And you can see here a little bit about my background. I've been in the structured content digital publishing world for a little over 15 years after kind of stumbling into that. I'm very pleased to get to be a part. And anyway, I guess the thing I'm most proud of, though, is that I've been married to actually the most beautiful girl in the entire world for more than 30 years. So, but that's a topic for another time.
No, you tell a lie. That's my wife.
All right, but let me tell you quickly about DCL. DCL, basically, our job is to solve problems with content formats. And we've been doing this for more than 40 years. So if you have content that has lost flexibility because it's in Word or it's in PDF or it's in InDesign, we help get you into smarter and more flexible formats, HTML, XML, DITA, S1000D, DocBook, whatever. Instead of a do-it-yourself kind of a solution where you're faced with doing the content prep, the cleanup, steep learning curve, all that kind of thing, we actually offer a full service solution. And so that includes, identifying and implementing your new smarter content through a reuse analysis and reuse services. It's conducting really rigorous QA. We're trying to minimize the work that you have to do. So you'll get a better sense of that as we talk a little bit about the project itself. And I think that's what you're here for, is to hear about that project. So let's get in and let's talk about the story. Dipo, what's the background here?
Okay, so, we thought, let's do a webinar. Let's show people how to convert content. But then what everyone else does is they pick the best kind of format of content possible, something that's going to be really easy to show off. We thought, let's not do that. Let's take a real world scenario. And so we contacted Liftify as an aircraft manufacturer, and they provide us two types of manuals, a service manual, a maintenance manual, and a user manual. So that's pretty representative. Now, if we got a real manufacturer's manual, that means we've got real content to convert. And as such, we're able to test the limits of the process, the limits of the tools. And, we're not provided, we've not got proper tables that have been set up to work exactly right for our tools. So we've got two large documents, and they're legacy PDFs. Because why PDF? Well, that's one of the hardest forms of content to convert. It's maybe a little bit easier if your content is already in XML. And so, we said, let's go from the PDF so that we can show you that even if you've lost the source document, for example, in this case, Liftify had bought the company from another manufacturer. They didn't have all of the source files, and we were ready to show them that you don't have to have that. You just have the PDF files, and we're able to then convert that. So this demonstration is focusing on something that does not have semantic context in it. Word files, you use styles to show that this is a paragraph and so on. You've got a little bit of semantics going on in there. With your PDF, it's just straight text, and it's often the most difficult type of content.
Yeah. So for those of you who haven't done this, and I know there's a lot of experts that are attending, if you haven't been here before, when we talk about structured content versus unstructured content, a PDF document is generally an unstructured document. It's got text. but it doesn't really, tell the computer all the things that it needs to do. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to convert it into a structured format. And there's just a ton of benefits here. If you just look, industry wide, you conversion at the component level inside a document instead of just, the full document. You can get multiple output formats from a single source. A big benefit is this whole idea of, translation. And we'll talk more about that individually, because that did mean something here. Another big one is search, right? So with a PDF, you can search for text, and the computer, knows it can recognize a text if you search it, but it doesn't know that, this particular piece of text is a detail. It doesn't know that it's this is a model number, or this is, whatever. And so we're going to add tags around that. But I think the biggest one, and Dipo, I'm going to pass it back to you here in just a second here, is this idea of content reuse, right? So a lot of times you have, content that's the exact same across multiple documents. In this instance, we had 2 documents. It was relatively, small, but, when you think about it, a lot of organizations have, 15, 20, 100 documents that all might have similar text components in there. And when you change something at the source level, you have to go through in all those individual documents and find it. Whereas with a, kind of a structured content format with reuse, you can make the change and automatically propagate it. So anyway, Dipo, I mentioned you had a specific example here from this group. So I'm going to pass it back to you here to talk.
Yeah, so one of the advantages of switching from Word or any other unstructured content format is the improved ability to share content. You just said that. Now you can granularize your components as far or as big as small as you want. And in this example here, we've got in a document, you could have modules, sections, components, all the way down to paragraphs, figures, and tables. And so that granularity depends on you. And one of the major things that you would share across document would be like figures, images, tables as well. If you've got a big table with 253 lines in it, and you've got to change lines 78 and 34, how do you do that across the 5 documents where you've copy and pasted it in Word? Well, if you've got that content as reusable content, you're referencing one table document, and so you just make the change in that one document, and the next time you publish, all your documents have been pulled up to date. Another very, very important one, and this is coming from my years working in a regulated sector, is safety notifications. Now, in this example that you can see on there, you can see that there's a turning radius of 5.5 meters on there. Now, as a manufacturer, you're always trying to make improvements. And if you then make a change to the equipment that reduces that wheel radius to 3 meters, for example, you would have to go into each of those Word documents to change it. And you could end up missing one, or you could end up typing, 3.2, or, the mistakes happen. If you're reusing safety information, you just have to make that change once, and the next time you publish, everything's done for you. So that, those are all kinds of reuse mechanisms that you can put into place, and safety notifications is one that I advise everyone to always reuse. Do not ever, even if you're in Word does have very rudimentary reuse mechanism, but the main thing is to single source, make the change once and have it replicated.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, talk to us too about this other benefit that Liftify was looking for, the paperless cockpit.
Yeah, so the problem with PDF and print is that it costs a lot of money to keep these things in the plane. A dozen manuals are heavy. Take a look at that bag on there. There's 6, 8, 10 manuals in there. A lot of, you've got to save weight. Weight is a big factor on an airline. And the aircraft that we actually converted, the XA4142, has only 10 additional kilos of baggage allowed on there. If 5 of those are taken up with your manuals, that means you've only got your underpants and maybe a couple of changes of shirt in your baggage on there. So in 2011, the FAA approved the use of iPads and other suitable tablet computing devices as electronic flight bags. They're Class 1 EFBs, they're called. so that they can pilots can use them for display approach plates, terminal procedures, airport diagrams. And then, like, in 2017, that was actually generalized, so a lot more companies were able to start transforming their paper documentation into electronic formats. So by using electronic charts and manuals, safety and efficiency on the flight deck is significantly enhanced. So it's one of the advantages of moving over into a paperless document. Your searches will be faster. You can show contextualized information as and when you want it, rather than having to flip through pages. I don't think I want my pilot flipping through 600 pages to find out how to safely land on water because one of the
Well, and the naysayer out there would say, well, okay, so you got it into PDF. You can read a PDF on a tablet, but the truth is that you're still having to page, right? And it makes it much more difficult. And what if you have a smaller device? What if you have more like a mobile phone or something like that? So that really takes us into there's really a lot of industry specific benefits here. First of all, users need the same content in different contexts. A pilot might need just that paragraph on a mobile display, right? He might need to know, hey, because this error is going on, here's the solution, and it needs to be prompted. Structured content lets you do that. PDF doesn't. But the maintenance crew might use that same text on the ground, and they may want a page-based version. They may want an iPad version, or they may want a print version. It may make sense to have it laid out in a larger context. I think another big thing is, the idea that different users have similar content, but they also require very specific things. In the past, if you have one version of the manual for this particular model, but this model it's all the same except for these few things. Well, you're still keeping up an entirely different model. When illustrations and examples might be the same throughout, most of it just are different in a few places. And so this structured content is going to let them have that ability to reuse. I think another big thing is voice assistants, text-to-speech applications, chatbots, all of those kind of things. They're driven by being able to have these structured content components. And then, of course, the translation, because airplanes are flown by people around the world. A lot of times you have to get things translated into many different languages. And if you're doing it document by document, you're translating the same content over and over. So anyway, let's dig in. Let's actually talk about the project, kind of how we approach this and how we would approach a similar project. Here's the high level overview. Basically we're going to do some steps on the front end that are, analysis related. And then we're going to start actually taking care of the conversion, get it delivered, and we'll walk through each of these step by step. So let's just jump in and let's hit at the start, talk a little bit about the actual requirements that we got from the client.
Okay, so project requirements, basically what did we have to set up and what did we need to do on our side? And so one thing we want to be able to do is for DCL to be able to deliver the conversions directly into the Componize repository. We want to stop all that sending zip files by email or having to send me FTP details and then I log in and everything. So we could set up a Componize repository for DCL to directly connect to us. Remember, open APIs and so on. We want to be able to identify each delivery. We want to be able to validate XML content as and when it comes into the repository. And so if there's an error in one of them, it gets flagged, and we're able to quickly request while the pudding's still hot, quickly request a redelivery. We want to be able to extract and apply metadata, so things like the aircraft model, keywords and tags and things like that. We want to be able to optimize the use of that. And we want to be able to manage access rights and permissions. Only certain people are allowed into the project at this stage because we don't want somebody messing things up.
So you've got a fantastic tool to be able to help meet these requirements, but it takes more than just a tool. It takes some other steps, and so we were really pleased to get to be brought in to kind of start the process. And so really the first step in all the projects that we do is we do some analysis, and we include our tool Harmonizer that I'll talk about more here in just a second. But but really, I think the difference between us as a full service vendor, what helps make our projects really successful is all the analysis and configuration and customization that goes into the projects. I was telling somebody yesterday, you can take, there are transforms all over the internet. Going to DITA, you've got DITA Open Toolkit. You can create valid XML pretty easily, but the truth is how useful is it going to be? One size really doesn't fit all. I mean, yes, you can get XML, but are you going to get the XML that you need that's going to actually drive your results? So we spend a lot of time, digging in and talking about, what are the different document types? I mean, in this case, we had a flight manual and we had a maintenance manual. In other instances, we might have, 10, 15, 20 different kinds of documents. What are the formats we're working with? In this example, we had one format, PDF. But in several of our projects, we'll do multiple formats. We'll have Word, or we'll have InDesign, or we'll have other flavors of XML. I think for one of our clients, we did 13. Actually, the project we did with you a couple of years ago, I think, was more than one format back at GE. Yep. And just the different formats, they're all handled a little differently, right? So if something's a PDF image where it's been scanned, how we're going to extract the data from that and get it tagged is going to be a little different than, like, say, a regular PDF. Obviously, how languages are approached is going to be different. The level of QA that's needed, complexities, math, tables, cross-references, compliance, all of that. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that. And then we're going to dig in and we're going to analyze the potential reuse, because reuse is that big use case that we were talking about, right? And so for that, we have this tool called Harmonizer. It's an industry-leading tool, and it does really two key things, right? First of all, it summarizes the reuse of text blocks across large repositories of documents. And it's really useful for organizations that are trying to build a business case for moving to a component content management system, or moving to a structured content management type of a solution. So many organizations have this idea, I know we've got a lot of reuse, and they try to sell that to management, but they're really just, kind of putting their finger up, trying to, make a guess. Harmonizer comes in and tells you, hey, this is how much is in this repository. And you can start to build some real numbers with that. But it doesn't just tell you, hey, here, you've got some reuse. It actually also shows you within each document where that reuse is, both exact matches and close matches. So you can make then decisions about how you want to take advantage of this, right? So as an example, I worked with some banking documents a few years ago in another company. And we had these 4 documents. They're only about 20 pages each. There was one for each geographic area. Some of the sentences across the 4 documents were exactly the same. Some of the paragraphs, some entire sections were exactly the same. But in other cases, these different, text blocks had minor variations. For example, in the US, maybe you had to have this legal statement that wasn't in the other 3. Or in Mexico, it used a different, product name or something like that. So we sat down and we laid out all the documents on a desk, and we got a spreadsheet out. And it took me 2 solid weeks to analyze this content manually. And this is 4 documents, 80 pages, right? Total. And it's something that Harmonizer, using its algorithm and its character sequences, could have done in less than a minute. And it could have done 400 documents, or 4,000 documents at once, and not just 4. So anyway, for this particular client, we ran the report. It didn't have, between those 2 documents, it didn't have a whole lot of reuse. But the reuse that it did have was pretty useful. So here's a couple examples from Harmonizer. This first one, what this is showing you is there's a paragraph here. It's actually, 3 sentences? And these 3 sentences are used in the same manual in 4 different places, right? And so this is an important thing because, this could be a text block that we might use as its own component. Or it might have a paragraph before, a paragraph after, and we could create a topic or something like that. This is the kind of thing that,
and look,
sure.
Sorry, looking at it, I mean, like, you know, why would you want to have 4 versions of this paragraph floating around in the same manual? Basically, you're looking for trouble here. And if this was like, you know, crucial information and you had to change something on there, it's just so easy to forget to change one of the instances, you know, even using the search that's available within whatever in a PDF, you know, you search for one word, you get with 2,300 examples, and then you try and make it more precise. And because of the way PDFs, like, you know, chop off the end of sentences, if you happen to take something that has a return line return in it, then it won't find it, even though it does exist in there. So, like, this is a perfect example of, like, you know, a paragraph that is reused 4 times. Well, you might as well just create one block.
And this is in the same document. You know, the next example shows, you know, the same sentence that's actually in 2 different documents. And this is more of a warning operating procedure thing. Now, this one here, you can see there's a little bit of red and green there. That's indicating that it's slightly different. The only difference here is that in the maintenance manual, this block is part of a bulleted list. So there's no punctuation at the end. There's no period. And in the flight manual, it actually is part of another section, another sentence. And so it does have a period. But again, this is something where
full stop is a ridiculous reason to have varied content, isn't it?
Yeah. And so this kind of thing, you know, you see, this is the kind of thing that a lot of times you see will affect your chat bots and things later, because you don't have standardized content. One writer writes it one way, another writer writes it another way. You know, somebody, you know, they shorthand one word or, you know, they change another one. But, you know, this is a kind of an example that we might find here. Again, this is just a sentence. Sometimes it's an entire paragraph that you can look at. And we can give you, anybody on here, if you just contact me, I can give you a Harmonizer demo and really go through these in detail. You know, we don't only have so much time today. Third example I have here, this is one that these are 2 things that are in the same manual, but they're for different procedures. One's for takeoff, one's for landing. Sometimes we see this where you'll see a procedure where it talks about, you know, turn the screwdriver clockwise, and then there's another one that says turn it counterclockwise. It's very, very useful for capturing those things and helping you to figure out maybe where you could use conditional content. Or check to make sure that, you know, if you have an A, you have a B, you know, in a set of steps. Or make sure if you're supposed to have it in all your documents. A client in a regulated industry a few years ago sent me 17 documents, and we ran a Harmonizer analysis, and we found an exact match. It was like 16 different times, and they were like, "Yep, that's such to say that's in all of our documents." And I said, "Oh, well, you sent me 17 documents, and there's only 16 here." And sure enough, one of their documents didn't have it, you know, and so that was something they had to go fix. We had another example where, you know, a procedure in 40 different instances for another aircraft manufacturer all said turn the dial clockwise, and one of them said turn the dial counterclockwise. You know, and that would have been, you know, a significant.
That's the one that didn't come back.
Yeah. So, you know, this tool can really use that. So it's a tool that we use to really try to set the stage, and really sets us up for this next step, which is, you know, putting together the strategy. So with this strategy, we're going to take that initial content analysis, our understanding of the formats, our understanding of the use cases, right? What metadata is needed to be able to drive your use case. And we're going to take this content reuse and talk about how we're going to apply it, how we're going to implement it. What's our reuse strategy going to be? Why don't you talk a little bit here about the annotated topic list, and then we'll jump in and I'll talk about the conversion configuration.
Yeah, the annotated topic list is something I discovered actually when like you said, you know, we've done some work together when I was at GE. I was in charge of the migration there. And the annotated topic list is basically a way for you to help DCL set up the conversion matrix, i.e. you start making rules so that you can identify, create a topic for every time you meet a chapter or every time you come to a paragraph. that would be like, you know, really tiny segments. But also things like if you encounter a list and it's a numbered list, then most likely this is going to be a task. So take that segment of content and create a task topic from it. And so once the, like, you know, first analysis has gone on and, like, you know, you produce that, it's an Excel file basically in the annotated topic list. They then get sent back to you as a client, and you go through it and either confirm that, yes, these are all task topics, these are all concepts, these are all reference types, you know, and so on and so forth, so that you then standardize the conversion. You always make sure that anything that's a numbered list is most likely a task. So make sure that the task DTD is applied to it, and, like, you know, the header type, the doc type is task, and so on and so forth. And that way you're starting to set up your content to be structured with semantic meaning.
So the idea here is that we're, instead of just, you know, kind of taking a software, creating some XML so we can get it into their system, we're really creating this plan. We're spending a lot of time on the front end getting things right, because as our friend Regina from Content Rules says, you can't just shove your content into a new tool without a plan and still expect to have a smooth and flawless transition, right? So at this point, you know, we take all this stuff, we're going to start taking, you know, configuring the automation. We're going to get a conversion spec together. We're going to run samples with the client. We're going to make sure that it looks right. That's what we did here. Make sure that what we were told was what is going to come out on the back end. We're going to then, you know, address special things that we expect to come up. We're going to create a whole QA plan. We're going to create QA software. We're going to know which QA software to put where, and then put that ramp up plan together. And then meanwhile, you guys are going to be over there with your tool, getting this repository configured.
Yep. And so, like, you know, on our end, like I said, you know, we can accept pretty much anything. However, like, you know, when you don't want to just dump everything into a repository, you want to, as the content come in, you want to start applying rules and properties and things like that. And so what we've got to do on our side is create things like folder rules. So DCL delivers a zip file containing all the thousands of topic files. Well, we want to unzip it and then put each of the subfolders, or, you know, all the different content into the correct location. We want to apply aspects. Now, aspects allow additional functionality to already existing content types. So they're properties. And so examples would be, like, you know, to enable versioning on a particular content type, enable XML validation so that you're able to, like, open it up and make sure that it fits and is valid according to your DTD. Enable link management, extracting metadata fields, and even sending an email as soon as, like, DCL makes that delivery. I don't need to have them send me manually an email. The system, Componize, will just send me an email saying new content delivered, or however else you've set it up. We also want to, like, you know, create publication pipelines or modify the ones that come within Componize. So we've got standard ones for PDF and HTML. We've got to make it look like the manual that we're converting. And so that means a little bit of XSL FO, and connecting it to the publication platform as well. So if we're using, for example, we partner quite a lot with Fluid Topics, you know, if you're connecting with that as a delivery platform, you've got to set up all the pipelines so that as soon as your content is complete, approved, when you hit publish, it goes directly onto your publication platform. You can also set other things like translatable, publishable, and things like that to further, you know, make sure that you have control of your content. So if I take an example of, like, you know, the rules configuration, is that as soon as content comes into this source folder, I can drag my rules and make sure, like, you know, that I put them in the order that I want it to be applied. So here, I'm going to enable XML validation straight away, metadata and link management, and also enable versioning. And on the right, you know, I can do a little bit more of, like, you know, the setup on that rule, edit it a little bit more, make it run in the background, apply to subfolders or just the folder, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. And so an example of like, the aspects we've got. So we've said like, aspects are properties that you apply to particular files. And so I set up a rule and I say apply some aspects. And then what are the aspects? Well, I want to make a file versionable. I want to apply XML validation, allow metadata and link management. And I also want to extract the metadata. That's a very particularly useful one, extracting metadata, so you can work on it in a clear place where you've got all the metadata converged, taxonomy tool or something like that.
All right, so we've got our plan set up, we've got the repository set up. Now we move into production. And production doesn't necessarily have to be something where we're doing all of your content at once. In this particular example, they had 2 documents, so we were able to deliver that as one. But it could be in other instances that you want to divide things out, because we're going to, want to run an initial publication. We want to make sure that everything is the way that it's supposed to be done. Now, we'd already done some sampling along the way, so we should be in good shape. So when production hits, we just start taking in documents. We start running them through the automation, depending on the particular industry. In this one, we did some reviews kind of in the middle before we actually did the DITA conversion. But then sometimes after the DITA conversion, we have XML validation, we have automated QA checks. We actually also add some human component type checks, because again, this is very important information that has to be 100% correct. Then we package it up, put it in a zip file, and we're able to deliver directly. And one of the great things about Componize is they have a terrific system where you can load the repository folder within a site, and then it'll automatically unpack, and with that repo set up the way it is, get everything into the right place, just exactly how it was planned. So we do that, and then at that point we turned it back over to you guys to really start doing the publication, do any additional cleanup. Now we do everything we can to minimize that cleanup, but there's always a little bit. And usually after the first round, there's some conversion that some different steps that you might do. So walk through this and talk a little bit about some of the things that you do here and that you did on this project.
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier on, you've got to first of all, look at things like when you publish with the out of the box conversions, you don't get exactly what you had. If you were starting from a brand new document, fair enough, you could accept exactly what's out in the box. However, if you're trying to replicate something that exists, you've got work on the pipelines to do. So, for example, working on the XLFO to fine tune the PDF version. Componize comes with its own HTML5 CSS, and so you can just take that file, work on it. New images that need to be referenced, new classes need to be created, and so on. Work on that, as just the HTML, and then when you transform, it looks like what you want it to look like. Oxygen, our preferred editor as well, has its own web help responsive customizations that you can do, and even the out of the box one is pretty good. But again, if you want it to look like what in this case we were converting an existing manual. And so we had to make sure that, the logo was in the right place, the image of the airplane, headers and footers, the way that, footers, text references and things like that were treated, were all standardized to make it look like the original file. We've also got to review image sizes. Now, you could apply a global approach to image resizing. I did that while I was with General Electric Healthcare, and it worked to a certain extent. However, if you've got a group of authors and they've not been following the style guides to the letter, and apart from having robots working for you, there's no way you can have 40, 50 writers and have every single one of them respect the rule 100% of the time. And so, you've still got to go into things and, look at it and then create rules so that if an image size is, for example, over this size and over this resolution, then reduce it to this. And you could create, rules like that and then use your tools to automatically resize image. You've also then got to review metadata and tagging. Are there tags, metadata elements that are inside of a document that are not really useful? Well, We want to review them and start removing them. So in this example here, we could take a look and see the actual XML. Looking at it in an XML editor, you know, I mean, Notepad even, and you can see that everything that's a keyword has automatically been picked up by Componize and is now applied to the content unit as well as tags. So high speed, maneuvers, XA41, XA42. So I know that this file actually applies to both models. You can see that straight away from that, even without opening the file to look at it inside of an XML editor. Things like, you know, the file name, the title, you know, the author, file IDs, the language, you know, all of those sort of things are available to you directly within the Componize interface without having to even open the file. And that makes the search facilities within Componize even more powerful, because it's not just searching like, you know, for content, but you can also like, you know, class that search by tag. So I want to look for everything that has XA41 and has this particular word inside of it. And that means you, rather than coming up with 600 like, you know, search results, I'll come up with like, you know, 22.
And there's some other things to check as well. I see here's the annotated topic list again.
Yeah. So again, you've got your first annotated topic list. You send that back to DCL. And like, you know, they run it through again, and then you get a next version. And then you compare your first annotated topic list with the results that you've just got, and you can fine tune that. So it's like, you know, it's a long Excel sheet, but it's worth the effort, because what you're doing there is making sure that your conversion then fits with the information architecture. And that also feeds into modifying the information architecture, like, you know, applying like, you know, the semantic doc types for topics. You know, if you find that, oh, there's some places that have been using numbering, but they're not tasks, then maybe you want to either revise your rules to say, well, certain types of numbering can be used not in a task, so we'll change the way that the numbering is done so that it's standardized across everywhere. You want to verify cross-references to tables and figures and things like that. So internal cross-referencing, you need to like, you know, check all of that. Footnotes, especially table footnotes, are very difficult to handle. So you want to check that, you know, the rules are applied properly as to how to identify them and where to put them. Some special characters might not convert automatically, and equations are one of the biggest headaches in the DITA world. You're either going to have to invest in a tool that will help you, like MathML, that will help you write proper equations, or you sort of like, you know, do something and then take a snapshot as an SVG file. So during that conversion, you've got to make that decision. Do you want to SVG file it so that, you know, people can still select and pick up text from the equation or copy the equation? You don't want it as an image file. Or you're going to use a specialized tool such as MathML to help write and then publish that content. Table formats as well. You've got to make decisions, individual decisions, deciding on how some table spanning might occur. You know, some table attributes like table width. This is a perfect example here. You know, how do you automate telling there's 3 columns on there. However, on that first header row, there's actually 2 rows, dimension and unit. So you've spanned that, and you've still got 2 columns on the right where conversion factor is. However, you've got 2 rows and you've spanned that first one. All of that has to be done. So you see the arrangement of the complex information at the bottom. You've got spaces at the top on the far right. In the middle, the content is at the top. And on the left, you've got all the content. And there's a little bit of a space in there. It's just impossible to automate this. So it's things that you have to go into and then sometimes work on manually.
Yeah. And we actually did a webinar just not too long ago about, you know, it's called Tables Are Tough. And it's because they are. Now, we're doing some cool things. We have some interesting partners that are doing things, but it's always an issue. I will say also about this whole cleanup and review process, since we only had the 2 documents in this one, it was a little bit of a condensed process. But if we really do the full project right with a larger document set, a lot of these things that we're talking about here, we actually identified during that sampling process, kind of at the beginning. And we do a couple of test runs with small amounts of documents to get those things right, so that then we can build the QA checks either programmatically for those things, or where it creates a workflow step that sends somebody, you know, hey, here's one of those instances, check it. Here's one of those instances, check it, as opposed to just finding it later or having to, you know, just kind of check everything. But this initial publication cleanup and review, it's really critical, and it leads us then, you know, now that we've done this conversion, you know, how do we fine tune that process? And just a couple of ways that you can fine tune it. Some of our clients will go back and they'll look at their Harmonizer report again, and they'll maybe make some revisions to some of their assumptions at the beginning. You know, so that's why a lot of times we'll do the conversions in, you know, different pieces, because you learn things along the way. And so we can, you know, make some adjustments for the next set of content about how we're going to apply taxonomy, or you know, what terminology did we leave out here.
And like, you know, I mean, if you take a look at that, you know, you're improving your architectural decisions by, like, you know, being able to specify, take a look at, like, you know, warnings, for example, you know, reuse. Where do you want to reuse it? Is this something that is unique because it can only happen in a workshop, or is it something that could happen in the workshop, but also while you're flying, you know? And you make that decision for the same warning. You could decide whether or not you want to duplicate it or reuse it.
Yep, absolutely. And then another thing, you know, with Harmonizer, you can give it to us and have us run the Harmonizer report, but we can also offer it to clients as a subscription. And many of our clients are starting to take advantage of that. And so they'll run additional Harmonizer reports along the way. They'll say, okay, so we applied it, boom, let's run it. What do we get? Did we miss anything? Do we want to adjust our strategy a little bit more? You know, maybe they do it quarterly, maybe they do it weekly, maybe they do it on different content sets. And then, you know, they start thinking, okay, well, now let's bring in maybe this next piece of content. Now let's bring in this next group of content. And so then we start to convert more, and we really run through the process again, which is kind of outlined here overall. So Dipo, why don't you walk through this, and then we'll jump into some of the benefits.
I mean, so it's just like, you know, the simplified workflow of what happens once content gets into Componize, you know. So DCL's harmonizers are over there on the left, and, like, you know, there's an FTP push into Componize. And then Componize, because of the rules we've set up on the delivery folder, first of all, ask the question, does the file or folder exist? Does it exist? Yes. Well, create a branch and deliver in a new folder or file, or overwrite it depending on the rules that you want. If it doesn't exist, well, deliver. And then apply the folder rules that I talked about earlier. So unzipping the file, applying folder permissions, applying aspects to enable versioning, and so on. I'm not going to go through the list again, sort of like, you know, running behind on time as well. But you can see on there that there's, like, you know, quite a lot of automated actions, you know, and then analyze the delivery and check the log files. That's a manual part. You take a look and see, are there errors there? Some of those, some of that analysis can actually be automated. If there's a file in there that is not valid XML, then shoot off an email. Remember, we said we could add an aspect, send email. Well, if XML is not valid, send email to DCL with file name and so on. You know, set things up so that you've got this automated workflow. And if the delivery is okay, then start cleanup tasks. Otherwise, send back to send the email or the content back to DCL. Then that work gets done over there to, like, you know, fix whatever issue it is, and then it comes back into the workflow.
So that's kind of how we approach this project, and we do these projects. We did actually help realize several benefits. You can see here that, you know, there was definitely some reuse between the two documents. The green here shows content that's exactly the same. The yellow shows kind of that variable content. So we were able to kind of hit on that. We also were able to hit on this idea of, you know, multiple formats and channels. So talk a little bit about this, Dipo.
Yeah. I mean, so if we're looking at, we're in a new age now. Not everything's paper. We've gone past, like, you know, everything being on paper. So stuff can get delivered on a PC. And that might be for, like, you know, studying for your exams, for your pilot exams. You know, you're looking through the manual, you're looking through the maintenance manual or, as a garage technician. And then as a pilot, you want your information on a tablet. Remember the electronic flight bag? Well, the same content can be published to the web, to your tablet, but also then in the workshop, the engineer, the aircraft engineer, the what's the word for it again? It might actually not want to be clicking around. They've got greasy fingers and so on. So he wants to have a print version, or he just wants to be able to scroll and go from page to page. And so he wants a PDF version. And so you make the choice as to what format you want. And moving to structured content gives you that ability to publish in multiple formats to multiple channels. And
it doesn't even have to be a document, right? It doesn't even have to be a full document. It can be segments. Yeah,
you can publish content segments. And so you can make it so that all the conversion factors, so just tables, you just want all the reference information, create a publication that contains just the reference information. So that flight checklist that the pilot has to go through every time, click, boom, you've got only flight checklists that come up, and you don't have to scroll through a description of, first of all, the reasons why you have to, which you would get in a PDF document.
And you can do really cool things too, right? If you're flying in one particular temperature and you get an error message, instead of having to look for that, you can set up your content to automatically give you what the answer is. Check this. And it'll be based on, that temperature. But if you're in a cold temperature, maybe it gives you a different result.
Yeah.
And maybe you're just getting just the segment that you need, or maybe you want to, set up 3D things. Structured content gives you that ability. I mean, there's just really tons more functionality. You've got flexibility. You've got the ability to be interoperable with different systems. You can connect with the other big systems that you've got, because you've got this XML. You've got the voice assist and the chat bot and the text to speech applications. You got the possibility for real-time updates, right? Instead of having to wait for that content to get the new PDF and replace the old PDF, you're getting those updates.
One of the use cases that I saw was creating task lists and linking them to content. So when you send an engineer to repair something that's gone wrong with a machine, they get the actual topics and procedures that they need to repair that particular item. So you've got the error code that's been added as metadata, and so that error code then pulls up, these are the procedures. And rather than just the procedure, because you get there, you open it up, I've got my tablet information. Oh, I forgot to bring the actual tools that I need. So your parts list is also on there as well, and it'll pick up the parts that you need to replace, put them with the procedures, and you've got your bag ready to repair the exact problem. And that's saving time. Service costs are one of the highest costs that organizations incur.
We're just about out of time, and we've got to do questions here, but I know compliance is something that's near and dear to your heart. So take a minute here to talk about this, and then we'll move into our questions.
Yeah, compliance and change management. 14 years in regulated industries has just basically got me looking at, and I spot error messages that are nonsense. I spot things where there shouldn't be. So where use reporting. Why would that be useful? Well, you've got a safety message and somebody's pointed out that you need to change this. Rather than just blindly changing it, what you should be doing is, where have I used this content? And to make sure that if you do change it, it does apply in those other contexts as well. Rather than just blindly changing a figure, if you find that, okay, well, it only applies when this thing is superheated or when it's at a certain voltage, then you might want to duplicate it and leave the one that is a danger as a danger, rather than just blindly changing. And then, if you were in your Word document, just copy paste, and you put it everywhere. And you've got improved content auditing as well. You know what version you use to produce what. when the auditors come in, those of you in regulated industries, you want to be able to, like, just lay out a sheet and say, well, this publication, these are the exact components that I use, and they were all at this version. Oh, was something changed? Well, an engineering change request was raised, and inside of the engineering change request, well, we said it impacted this topic because we've done a well-used reporting. It impacted this topic, and this topic, and those are the ones that we changed. Take a look. We produced it with only these, and if you compare to the last version, those are the versions on there. Access controls prevent unintended change. You don't want marketing department working on, like, some of your. I always attack the marketing department, and even though I'm part of them now, but like, you don't want them changing stuff to make it like, we are the best. Unless you can prove that you are the best, that is not what you want in your documentation.
All right. Well, I know we want to have a few minutes here for questions. Marianne is back on. But you've got another webinar coming up. You want to talk about this quickly?
Yeah, I'd like to invite everyone who's on there. We're going to be, like, going further. Let's, like, show you more. Now, Toyota Motors Europe uses Componize, and they use it to create service bulletins. So how do you automate and better control the production of maintenance documents with dynamic forms, dynamically assembled documents based on templates and variables, and using data from, like, third-party systems? You're able to just, like, fill in a form and click a button, and you create most of your service bulletin. So join us for that. It's on the 11th of May at 1600 hours. That's Central European time. You'll have to do the conversion to your times in your heads.
Love it. All right, Marianne, what questions do we have?
Well, we have a number of questions, and I don't know if we're going to get through them all, but I want to let everyone know that I know between Dipo and David, they will personally follow up. So let's try to hit them. And I do also want to share both of our websites here, so I'm going to go ahead and push that. So Dipo, the aircraft maintenance manual is heavy on parts information. Was part specialization an aspect of the project?
Yeah, the parts lists were mainly tables, and for this manual, because the actual aircraft had passed between so many manufacturers, this was about the third or fourth owner, and they didn't always have the full files. We had some of the tables as images, so we had to work with DCL as to, like, was it worth the effort to run those images through and extract the text, then create tables? And for most of the case, that was it. And so they had to, like, do that extra processing to convert image-based tables into, proper tables of parts lists. Hope that was the question. That was the answer to the question.
Great. David, can you speak to converting InDesign files? We had a question, does it generate a PDF, the same layout? Why don't you just could you quickly kind of talk through that process?
Yeah, I'll give my favorite answer that you always hear on these things, and that's it depends, right? So InDesign is going to depend on a couple of things. We're going to look at, how many documents that we're dealing with. We're going to look at, is there any consistency in terms of InDesign styles that are used? Is that something that we can use? We're going to look at, how regularly the text is done, and we may go directly from the InDesign file. Sometimes if there's not a lot of consistency, sometimes it actually is easier to just produce the PDF and convert from the PDF. So it all just really depends. I'd be happy to talk to whoever is about it, get one of our project managers on, and we can dig deep, take a look, and figure that out.
We have 1 minute, okay? Is there a content reuse sweet spot where conversion pays off? Maybe a one-word answer.
I don't think it's the same for everybody.
Yeah.
I think it does, but
it depends.
It's something that you want to be aware of, right? And I think you'll know in your particular use case, it doesn't make sense or does it not, based on how much pain you're dealing with in terms of fixing things. We have some clients who it takes months because of the regulatory things to do simple changes because they have to find every place, they have to make sure it's right, resubmit it. And so if you could take 5 months off of a process, why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And depending, I suppose, it also depends, like, how many products have you got, and how often do you change it, and how many writers do you have, and those are the sort of things, if you're in a tiny little startup and there's just you there, then maybe, you're managing to keep things on track. However, if you think about the future, what happens if you leave the company? Then you've left, like, a whole load of, for like the person following you. So if you had your content already structured in something that had, like, versioning and, were able to manage all of that sort of stuff, it might be worth making that conversion. Or you might just think, well, I keep my folder structure really well done. I add notes to things, and so on, and that's enough for somebody to follow. It's really variable.
So we have come to time. We're a little bit over. The final question is a Harmonizer question. So I know David will reach out directly to Frederick. So thank you, everyone, for spending your time with us today. These webinars are really put on to help educate and support our industry. We provide a number of different services, such as webinars, newsletters, blog posts. We invite you to visit both of our websites. Please stay in touch, and we look forward to having you at our next event.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, David. Thanks,
Marianne.
Webinar. And thanks to our moderators who are in the background, doing all, like, taking a look through the chat and pointing out the questions and that. Don't forget to visit our websites, especially if you want to, if you have more questions, feel free. You've got my LinkedIn. Follow me on LinkedIn and so on. And, just get in contact, and we can always maybe schedule a session. And, well, remember the webinar on the May the 11th. Thanks.